The moment Isabella Morgan stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt an immediate sense of satisfaction. This was her domain, where everything had to be in perfect order. Every seat neatly arranged, every passenger in their rightful place. It was a delicate balance, and she took pride in maintaining it. After years of working as a flight attendant, she had developed a sharp instinct for when something wasn't right. And today, something wasn't right. Her eyes scanned the rows of well-dressed passengers, their designer luggage tucked neatly into overhead compartments. Some were already flipping through the airline's premium menu, others adjusting their seat settings. It was the usual mix of business executives, seasoned travelers, and the occasional celebrity. But then, her gaze landed on him. Seated near the window in 3A. The man was quiet, relaxed. He wasn't scrolling through emails like the others. Wasn't barking orders at an assistant over the phone. He simply sat there, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. A subtle motion that somehow irritated her. Something about him felt out of place. His suit, while expensive, lacked the flashiness she was used to seeing in first class. His shoes were polished, yet understated. His presence was calm, composed, not the usual hurried or entitled air she had come to expect from those who occupied these seats. It made her uneasy. Isabella took a step closer, her posture straightening. She prided herself on her ability to detect when someone was in the wrong seat. And her gut told her this was one of those moments. Clearing her throat, she stood beside him, her polished nails grazing the edge of the seat in front of him. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she expected him to fumble for an excuse, to show a flicker of guilt or nervousness, just like so many others had before when caught trying to slip into a seat they hadn't paid for. But he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her without a word. She barely glanced at it before handing it back. A nagging feeling inside her refused to quiet. Just because he had a ticket didn't mean there hadn't been a mistake. It had happened before. Maybe a last-minute mix-up. Maybe he had somehow been upgraded by error. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of this seat," she continued, her voice lowering slightly. First class is reserved for priority passengers. There it was, the expectation that he would either argue or comply. That he would show some sign of recognition that he didn't belong. But instead, the man just raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing together in what seemed to be mild amusement rather than offense. "This is my seat," he said simply. His voice was steady, confident, no frustration, no anger, just quiet certainty. The response unsettled her. She had dealt with passengers who tried to talk their way into an upgrade before. They usually got defensive, their tone dripping with entitlement. Or they tried to charm their way into staying. But this man did neither. He just waited. A few nearby passengers had begun to turn their heads. Whispers spread in hushed tones. But Isabella barely heard them. Her focus remained on the man in front of her. He wasn't moving. He wasn't giving in. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "I don't know how you got this ticket," she said, keeping her voice controlled but firm. "But I need you to move to economy before we take off." Still, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped something out quickly, then set it back on his lap. He folded his hands together, his fingers interlocking, his expression still as unreadable as before. "I'll wait right here." The words sent a strange chill down her spine. Not because they were defiant, there was no aggression behind them, but because of the certainty in which they were spoken. He wasn't pleading his case. He wasn't trying to explain himself. He was simply waiting for something. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Isabella felt a sliver of doubt creep into her mind. Passengers were watching now, their curiosity thick in the air. Some were whispering, some merely observing, but all of them were waiting for what would happen next. She hated the attention. She was supposed to be the one in control, the authority in the room. Yet somehow, this man had stripped her of that without saying more than a handful of words. Her fingers twitched at her sides as she debated what to do next. She had the authority to call security if needed. But was it really necessary? He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't being aggressive, but still, something about him unsettled her, his patience. His calm demeanor. The way he seemed completely unfazed by the situation. Then, the crackle of the intercom broke through the tension. "Flight attendant, please report to the cockpit immediately." Her stomach twisted. That wasn't normal. The captain rarely called for her unless something urgent had come up. She shot the man one last look before turning on her heel and walking briskly toward the front of the plane. Her thoughts racing. She told herself she had handled the situation correctly. That she was just doing her job. That she had been enforcing the rules. Nothing more. But as she reached the cockpit door, a strange weight settled in her chest, one she couldn't shake. Because deep down, in the smallest, quietest part of her mind, she knew something was wrong. And she was about to find out just how wrong she had been. Isabella's heart pounded as she walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Every step feeling heavier than the last. The intercom announcement had been abrupt, sharp, carrying an urgency that sent a ripple of unease through her. The cabin felt different now, charged with tension. The weight of passengers' stares pressing into her back. She refused to turn around. To see their expressions. To acknowledge the whispers that grew louder with each step she took. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the captain's voice had called her. In the electric energy that seemed to pulse through the narrow aisle. She swallowed hard as she reached the cockpit door, forcing herself to take a steadying breath before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick, the mood far more serious than she had expected. The captain stood near the controls. His fingers still curled around the intercom button. His expression unreadable. But it wasn't just him. On the screen mounted behind him, a corporate executive appeared via video call. Their face set in a cool, businesslike expression. And that was when Isabella knew, this wasn't a routine call. The moment she stepped inside, the executive's gaze snapped to her. Their tone clipped and direct. "Did you remove a first-class passenger from their seat?" The question hit her like a slap. And for the first time in years, she hesitated. She had been so certain, so sure of herself when she'd confronted the man in 3A. But now, under the sharp gaze of the captain and the corporate official, she felt something gnaw at the edges of her confidence. Still, she straightened her spine. "Yes, I did. He wasn't supposed to be there." A heavy silence stretched through the cockpit. The executive's lips pressed into a thin line. And the captain exhaled slowly, shaking his head before turning back to her. "You didn't check the manifest, did you?" The room seemed to shrink around her. The breath she'd been holding caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her mind raced, grasping for an answer, for some way to justify her actions. I saw his ticket, but you just assumed he wasn't meant to be in first class?" The executive cut her off, their voice carrying the kind of authority that made Isabella's stomach twist. She didn't answer, because she knew the truth was already clear. The executive leaned forward, their expression turning sharper. "The man you removed from his seat. The man you accused of not belonging. Is Malcolm Carter." The name sent a cold rush down Isabella's spine. No, that couldn't be. Not Malcolm Carter. Not the billionaire. Not the CEO. Not the man whose name was printed on every plane in this fleet. On every piece of company branding. On the very uniform she wore. Her breath hitched, her knees weakening. The executive's words drove the knife deeper. "You just tried to remove the owner of this airline from his own seat." The cockpit spun around her. The weight of the realization crashed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. The man she had challenged, the man she had humiliated in front of an entire cabin, had more power in this company than anyone else. A fresh wave of nausea curled in her stomach. She had made a mistake. A massive one. The captain's voice pulled her back to the present. His tone laced with disappointment. "Do you realize what you've done?" Isabella struggled to speak, her mouth dry, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. I thought there was a mistake." The executive's expression darkened. "Oh, there was a mistake. All right, but it wasn't his." A deep, crushing silence followed, suffocating her. She had spent years enforcing order, ensuring rules were followed, making snap judgments about passengers without hesitation. But today, she had judged the wrong man. The executive sighed, their voice clipped and final. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk back into that cabin. And you are going to apologize. Publicly, personally, and then, you are going to escort Mr. Carter back to his seat. The words felt like a branding iron against her pride. Apologize? In front of everyone? The thought made her stomach twist into knots. Passengers never questioned her authority. She gave instructions, they followed. She was the one who enforced order. Not the one who had to retract her words. But none of that mattered now. Because the man waiting for her in 3A could decide her entire future with a single sentence. The captain's voice broke through the thick silence once more. You should get moving. Every second you delay, the worse this gets. She swallowed, her throat tight, her hands trembling. Then, with slow, reluctant steps, she turned and walked out of the cockpit, back down the aisle toward first class. This time, she could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze. The whispers grew louder. She had humiliated him, and now, she was the one on display. When she reached his row, Malcolm Carter was still seated, still composed, still waiting. He hadn't moved an inch. His fingers rested loosely on his lap. His phone now tucked away. His expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something that sent a chill down her spine. He had known this moment was coming. He had never needed to raise his voice. Never needed to argue. He had simply let her walk into her own downfall. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady even as shame burned beneath her skin. Sir, she started, her words slower than usual. There's been a misunderstanding. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. The moment stretched, thick with tension. Malcolm Carter tilted his head slightly, studying her. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his tone even. She hated the way he said it. Hated the way he forced her to acknowledge what she had done. She pressed forward, even though it made her chest feel tight. I was mistaken. This is your seat. Her voice dropped. I apologize for the misunderstanding. Passengers held their breath, waiting. But Malcolm Carter didn't nod. He didn't accept the apology immediately. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. That's what you're calling it? She felt something crack inside her. She had expected this to be over quickly, a nod, an acknowledgement, a chance to move on. But he wasn't giving her an easy way out. He wanted her to sit in the weight of her own actions. He wanted accountability. Her breath came uneven now. Yes. For the first time, he let the silence linger between them. Then, slowly, he reached for his seatbelt and unbuckled it. The passengers held their breath as he stood. Isabella felt herself stiffen, unsure of what would happen next. Malcolm didn't follow her toward first class. Instead, he took out his phone again, tapped something, then slid it back into his pocket. And then he looked at her. Let's see what happens when we land. With that, he sat back down, without her. Without accepting her forced apology. Without even acknowledging her further. The power in the room shifted instantly. It was no longer hers. It never had been. A cold dread seeped into her bones. Because now, she wasn't the one making the decisions. She had no control over what happened next. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Because Malcolm Carter wasn't just a passenger. He was the storm that was about to change everything. The cabin was heavy with silence as Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The quiet murmurs of passengers. The curious stares. The subtle, knowing glances. It all became too much. Pressing down on her like the weight of an entire aircraft. Malcolm Carter remained seated, his presence a calm force amid the storm brewing around her. He had not raised his voice. Not once. He had not demanded recognition. Had not forced her into submission. Instead, he had simply waited, allowing the weight of her actions to settle on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. And now, as she stood there, the humiliation thick in the air, she realized something chilling. She had done this to herself. Isabella had spent years believing she was in control. She had always carried herself with authority. Her uniform crisp, her words sharp. She knew how things worked. how passengers were supposed to behave. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered, because she had judged him wrongly, and now the entire flight, the entire company, would know it. A small movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A woman in 4B, an older passenger, shook her head in disapproval before turning to whisper something to her seatmate. A man across the aisle glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid making eye contact with someone caught in a scandal. She had been respected once, feared, even. Now, she was something else, a lesson, a mistake on display. With her throat dry and her hands shaking, she forced herself to step back, nodding stiffly, as if that could somehow restore a sliver of the control she had lost. But Malcolm Carter said nothing. He did not smirk, did not gloat, did not revel in her discomfort. Instead, he merely turned his gaze out the window, as if she was no longer worth his attention. And somehow, that was worse. The rest of the flight passed in unbearable tension. Isabella remained at the front of the plane, pretending to be busy with checklists and final cabin preparations, though her hands trembled too much to complete even the simplest tasks. The younger flight attendant, Mia, who had been watching from the galley earlier, cast her a wary glance but said nothing. She wanted to scream at her. Say something. Tell me I was right. Tell me this is all just a misunderstanding. But no one would. Because she wasn't right. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. Isabella swallowed, gripping the counter beside her. This was real. This was happening. And it wasn't over yet. When the wheels touched the runway, the usual chatter of relieved passengers filled the cabin, the rhythmic hum of the plane's descent mingling with the shuffle of people preparing to leave. But Isabella barely heard any of it. Her mind was stuck on the intercom's final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as we have a special crew matter to handle before deplaning. The words hung in the air like a warning. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Some furrowed their brows, trying to make sense of it. Others, already attuned to the tension from earlier, had a knowing look in their eyes. Something was about to happen. And then, through the narrow window near the exit, she saw them, security officers, standing at the gate, waiting for her. A sharp, icy panic clawed its way up her spine. Her breath came quicker now, shallow and desperate. No, this couldn't be happening. She turned to the captain, searching for reassurance, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But he didn't meet her gaze. His jaw was tight, his hands stiff at his sides. He knew. They all knew. As the plane taxied to a stop, Isabella remained rooted in place, gripping the edge of the galley counter so hard her knuckles turned white. The doors opened, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the footsteps came. Heavy, purposeful. 2 security officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, their presence alone enough to make passengers crane their necks. And behind them, a man in a dark gray suit, polished and composed, the airline's senior operations manager. Isabella's stomach dropped. The entire cabin fell silent. The manager, Daniel Harrington, adjusted the tablet in his hands and spoke in a tone so clipped and professional that it sent chills down her spine. Miss Morgan, step into the galley, please. She hesitated. For the briefest second, she considered running, bolting down the aisle, escaping into the crowd of deplaning passengers. But that was ridiculous. There was nowhere to go. Slowly, on unsteady legs, she stepped forward. As soon as she was out of the passenger's view, the security officers followed, positioning themselves near the entrance, blocking her exit. The walls of the galley felt smaller now, the space shrinking as Daniel Harrington turned to her with the kind of look that only meant one thing. This was it. He didn't waste time. Isabella, I assume you know why we're here. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The operations manager sighed, tapping something on his tablet. A formal complaint has been submitted regarding your conduct on this flight. Multiple complaints. Actually, from passengers, from crew, from the captain himself. Her breath hitched. The captain? Her own captain? She felt like she had been slapped. Harrington continued, scrolling through the report. You removed a first-class passenger from their seat without verifying their credentials. You escalated a situation unnecessarily. You humiliated one of our most important individuals. And worst of all, he looked at her then. His gaze sharp, unforgiving. You did it because of an assumption. The words stung more than they should have. Because they were true. The realization settled deep in her chest, burning her from the inside out. I did this. I caused this. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. As of now, Harrington said, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind. You are suspended from duty pending an official investigation. The air left her lungs. Suspended. The word echoed in her mind. Hollow and unbearable. Her entire career, everything she had built, everything she had worked for, on the line. She had spent years enforcing the rules, believing she was untouchable, that her instincts were always right. And now? Now, she was the one being escorted off the plane. The passengers' whispers had grown louder now, their curiosity turning into something more, judgment. She had judged them for so long. Now, they were judging her. As she was led off the plane, her head low, her breaths shaky, she felt it, the loss, not just of her authority, but of something deeper, her identity. Who was she now, if not the flight attendant who always had the final say? If not the woman who controlled the cabin with unshakable certainty? The weight of it all threatened to crush her. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, her vision blurred with unshed tears. And then, one final moment, she turned back, just once, searching the cabin for him. Malcolm Carter, the man who had, without a single outburst, without a single demand, completely unraveled her. He sat there still, composed, unshaken, and when their eyes met, he did nothing. No gloating, no anger, just a steady, unwavering look that sent a chill straight to her bones. Then he turned back to his phone. As if she no longer mattered. As if she was already gone. And maybe she was. Because as she walked through the terminal, the security officers at her side, the reality of what had happened crashed down on her all at once. She wasn't just suspended. She was waiting for judgment. And Malcolm Carter was the one who would decide what happened next. The sound of her own footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as Isabella Morgan walked out of the airport's restricted area. Her mind spinning, her heart sinking into an abyss she wasn't sure she could climb out of. The cool, sterile air of the terminal should have been familiar. She had walked these halls for years. In control, confident, commanding. But tonight, she was walking through them as something else entirely. Not a leader. Not an authority. Just, a woman who had lost her way. Security had left her at the main exit. Their job done. Their presence no longer necessary now that she had been stripped of the authority she once wielded so effortlessly. The terminal bustled around her, passengers rushing to their gates. Children tugging at their parents' hands. Tired travelers waiting in long lines at baggage claim. She had been part of this world. Now, she wasn't sure if she ever would be again. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a costume that no longer belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the wrinkles on her blouse, as if fixing her appearance would somehow erase what had just happened. But nothing could erase this. Malcolm Carter. The name haunted her. It clung to the edges of her consciousness, repeating over and over like a cruel whisper. She had made a mistake, a massive, unforgivable mistake. And now, everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed for this career, was hanging by a thread. She had prided herself on being the best, on keeping order, on ensuring every passenger followed the rules. But today, she had been blind to her own failings. She hadn't been enforcing rules. She had been enforcing her assumptions. Her stomach twisted. How many times had she done this before? How many times had she asked certain passengers for their tickets while others passed by without question? How many times had she let her own biases guide her decisions? Completely unaware of the damage she was doing? A chime from her phone pulled her from the depths of her thoughts. She pulled it out, half expecting a termination email from Our. But instead, it was a message from Mia, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed everything. Mia, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? The text was simple, but it shattered something inside her. No one had ever asked her that before. Not really. She had spent so much of her life proving she was strong. proving she could handle anything. That she had never stopped to consider whether she was okay. And now, standing here, stripped of everything she had worked for, she realized she wasn't. She wasn't okay. Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to say. Did she lie? Did she brush it off? Did she pretend that this wasn't the worst moment of her life? In the end, she typed only one word. Me. No. Then she turned off her phone. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she walked. The city streets blurred around her as she wandered, her thoughts tangling into an unbearable knot of regret and self-loathing. The neon glow of street signs, the distant hum of cars, the muffled chatter of people passing by, none of it felt real. She passed a coffee shop and almost went inside. But then she saw her own reflection in the glass and froze. The woman staring back at her wasn't the woman she thought she was. She looked tired, hollow, small. When had she become this person? When had she stopped seeing people as people? She thought back to all the years she had spent climbing the ranks. All the times she had worked extra shifts. All the moments she had sacrificed to make a name for herself. She had done everything right. She had followed the rules. She had believed in the system. And yet, the system hadn't protected her tonight. Because the truth was, she hadn't been doing everything right. She had been enforcing rules selectively, believing she was fair when in reality, she had been anything but. And the worst part? She hadn't even realized it. Her breath hitched. She had never considered herself someone who judged others unfairly. She had always thought of herself as professional, competent, a leader who knew how to keep order. But Malcolm Carter's words came back to her. You thought you were just enforcing rules. But those rules seem to apply to certain people more than others. Don't they? She had dismissed his words at first. But now she couldn't ignore them. She leaned against the cool brick wall of the coffee shop. Her pulse unsteady, her mind a chaotic storm. For years, she had watched others make these mistakes. She had shaken her head at older flight attendants who treated passengers differently based on their appearance. She had whispered about them behind their backs, called them outdated, believed she was better. But was she? Really? Or had she just been blind to her own faults? A shiver ran through her. But it had nothing to do with the cold. She thought about Malcolm Carter again. He had every right to fire her, to destroy her career with a single email. But he hadn't. Instead, he had made her see. And that realization was more painful than anything else. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in thought. But eventually, she forced herself to move. She took a deep breath and started walking again. But this time, she wasn't aimless. This time, she knew exactly where she was going. The next morning, the email came. Subject: suspension order, next steps. Her hands trembled as she opened it, scanning the contents quickly. Unpaid suspension, mandatory review, formal bias training. It was all there, exactly as she expected. But it was the last line that made her heart stop. Final decision pending review by CEO Malcolm Carter. He was still deciding. She hadn't been fired yet. She had a chance. A single, narrow, fragile chance to prove that she could be better. She exhaled shakily. And then, before she could overthink it, she grabbed her phone and typed out a message. To Malcolm Carter. Subject: thank you, Mr. Carter. I know an apology isn't enough. I know my actions on that flight weren't just a mistake, they were a reflection of something bigger. Something I failed to recognize in myself. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see it now. And I am going to change. Thank you for giving me the chance to do that. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the send button. Then she pressed it. Because this wasn't just about keeping her job anymore. This was about becoming someone she could respect again. For the first time in her life, Isabella Morgan was ready to listen, to learn, to change. And whether she got her job back or not, she would never make the same mistake again. Support Isabella's journey. If you believe in second chances and the power of change, like this story, drop a comment below. Do you think she deserves her job back? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The city skyline blurred through the tinted windows as Isabella Morgan sat in the backseat of a cab. Her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her purse. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional honk of impatient drivers. She barely registered any of it. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, replaying the events of the flight. The humiliation of being escorted off the plane. The unbearable weight of Malcolm Carter's gaze. And now, she was heading straight into the lion's den. The corporate office loomed ahead, sleek and imposing, its glass walls reflecting the gray morning sky. She had been here before, but never like this, never under these circumstances, never as the woman on trial. Her stomach twisted as the car pulled up to the entrance. The driver didn't say a word as she stepped out, but she could feel his eyes on her. Maybe he had recognized her. Maybe he had seen the story spreading online. The whispers traveling faster than she could contain them. She forced herself to take a breath. This is it. She squared her shoulders and walked inside. The receptionist barely glanced up before nodding toward the elevator. Top floor. Mr. Carter is expecting you. Expecting her. Not firing her. Yet. The ride up was tortuous. Every second felt stretched, elongated by the sheer weight of what was about to happen. She stared at her own reflection in the metallic elevator doors, trying to find some semblance of the confident woman she used to be. She couldn't. The doors slid open, revealing a sprawling office space, open and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. And in the center of it all, behind a sleek black desk, was him, Malcolm Carter. He looked up as she stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled together in thought. Sit. One word. She obeyed. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbearable. She wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but she knew better. This was his moment, his decision, and she was entirely at his mercy. Finally, he leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked onto her. Tell me, he said, why do you think you're here? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. She swallowed, her throat dry. Because I made a mistake. His gaze didn't waver. What mistake? She hesitated. She could have said she misread the situation. That she was simply enforcing protocol. That she had been trying to do her job. But that wasn't the truth. Not really. Her voice was quieter this time. I assumed you didn't belong. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I looked at you. And before I even checked the manifest. Before I even confirmed your ticket. I decided you weren't supposed to be in first class. I didn't question myself. I didn't stop to think. I just acted. Her chest ached. Saying it out loud made it feel worse. More real. More damning. Malcolm didn't blink. He simply watched her, letting her words settle, letting her sit in the discomfort of her own realization. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into a folder on his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. He slid it toward her. She hesitated before picking it up. Her breath caught. It wasn't just about the incident on the flight. It was a collection of past complaints. Passengers she had questioned, tickets she had double-checked when others had walked by without issue. She felt her stomach drop. I didn't. Her voice trailed off. She hadn't even known these reports existed. Had never been told about them. Malcolm sighed, leaning back in his chair. You didn't know. Because no one ever held you accountable before. The words hit like a slap. She had spent years believing she was fair. That she enforced rules equally. That she was doing the right thing. But the proof was right in front of her. She hadn't been fair at all. The weight of it all was suffocating. She wanted to apologize again. But what good would it do? Words meant nothing now. So she waited. Malcolm exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. Then, finally, he spoke. You're suspended. The finality in his voice made her stomach twist. She had known it was coming. She had seen it in the email. But hearing it out loud made it real. But then, he kept speaking. Whether or not you come back to this airline, he continued, depends on what you do next. Her breath hitched. Not fired. Not yet. She sat up straighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. What do you mean? He slid another document toward her. This one looked different. She picked it up, scanning the words quickly. Her hands trembled. Bias training. 6 months of monitored performance review. Diversity and inclusion courses. A mandatory reassessment before reinstatement. She looked up at him. Confused. You're giving me a second chance? Malcolm didn't nod. He simply studied her. I don't believe in throwing people away for one mistake. One mistake. Her stomach twisted. Because she knew this hadn't been just one mistake. This had been a pattern. And he was forcing her to acknowledge it. You want a second chance? He asked. His tone firm. Then prove you deserve one. The weight of his words pressed down on her. She could walk out right now. She could accept her termination and try to rebuild her life elsewhere. Maybe she could apply to another airline. Maybe she could start over somewhere new. But deep down, she knew the truth. If she left, she wouldn't change. She wouldn't fix what was broken inside her. And she needed to. She needed to face the truth. She needed to be better. Her fingers curled around the pen. She hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, she signed her name. Malcolm took the document, his expression unreadable. But he nodded. Just once. You start next week. She exhaled shakily, the reality of what she had just done sinking in. This wasn't just about getting her job back. This was about becoming the person she thought she had been all along. Malcolm studied her for a long moment. Then tilted his head slightly. Tell me something, he said. Why did you do it? She swallowed hard. Because I saw you and assumed you weren't supposed to be there. The words burned as she said them. Malcolm nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Do you know how many times that's happened to me? Her breath caught. He leaned forward. Do you know how many times I've walked into a first-class cabin and had someone assume I didn't belong? She didn't move. She couldn't. I've lost count, he said simply. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had never thought about it like that. Never realized how deep this went. How many other people had felt the way he had? How many had walked off flights feeling powerless? Frustrated, exhausted by something they couldn't even prove had happened? Her throat burned. I'm sorry. Malcolm studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly. Good. His next words weren't cruel. They weren't punishing. But they cut through her like a blade. Now prove it. For the first time in her life, Isabella Morgan knew what she had to do. She had spent years believing she was fair. Now, she was ready to become fair. She stood, her hands still trembling. I won't waste this chance. Malcolm said nothing, just watched her as she walked out of his office. The hallway stretching ahead of her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what came next. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. Should Isabella get her job back? What would you have done in her place? If you believe in growth and redemption, like this story, subscribe for more powerful stories that make you think. The city skyline stretched before Isabella as she stepped out of Malcolm Carter's office. The cold morning air hitting her skin like a reminder, a fresh start. She had come here expecting the worst. She had prepared herself for the finality of losing everything she had built. And yet, she was walking away not with a punishment, but with a challenge. Now prove it. Those 3 words echoed in her mind, heavier than anything she had ever carried. This wasn't just about keeping her job. This was about becoming the kind of person who deserved to have it. She thought back to the woman she had been before stepping onto that flight. Confident, unquestioning, certain that she knew how the world worked. That she could see people for who they were. But the truth was, she hadn't really seen them at all. She had spent years enforcing rules without questioning if they were being applied fairly. She had convinced herself that she treated all passengers the same. But when it came down to it, she had looked at Malcolm Carter and judged him before he even opened his mouth. And that had cost her everything. But now, she had a choice. She could let that mistake define her. Or she could learn from it. The next 6 months would be the hardest of her career. The training program wasn't just a formality, it was a reckoning. It forced her to look at things she had ignored for years. To sit in uncomfortable truths. To confront her own habits. Her own biases. Her own failures. There were days she wanted to quit. Days when the weight of realizing just how many times she had made the wrong call felt unbearable. But every time she thought about walking away, she remembered something important. Malcolm Carter had given her a choice. Not everyone got that. He could have ended her career in a single moment. He could have fired her, gone public, made her name an example of everything wrong with the airline industry. But he hadn't. Instead, he had given her the chance to be better. And she refused to waste it. When the 6 months were over, she sat in front of the review board, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had passed every course. She had sat through every workshop, listened to every story from passengers and crew who had experienced what Malcolm Carter had, who had been made to feel like they didn't belong in a space they had every right to be in. She had changed. She knew that, but she also knew that it wasn't up to her to decide if that change was enough. The final decision lay in Malcolm Carter's hands. And when she walked into his office for the last time, her heart hammering in her chest, she knew this was the moment that would define her future. He studied her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "What did you learn?" She took a deep breath. "That I was blind to something I should have seen all along." Her voice didn't shake. "Not this time. I thought I was being fair. I thought I was enforcing rules. But I wasn't. I was enforcing my own assumptions. And that's not just unfair, it's dangerous." Malcolm nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Then, without hesitation, he picked up a folder, opened it, and slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Her reinstatement letter. A fresh start. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for it, her hands trembling. She had earned this. Not because she had begged for it. Not because she had apologized. But because she had done the work. Because she had changed. Because she had proven that she was more than her worst mistake. She looked up at Malcolm Carter, gratitude thick in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. His expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Just make sure that the next time you're faced with a choice like that, you choose differently." She nodded. She would. Lessons from Isabella's story. Isabella Morgan's journey isn't just about redemption, it's about growth. It's about recognizing the power of unconscious bias, the way small decisions can have massive consequences, and the importance of taking responsibility for our actions. Small diamond, we all make mistakes. But real change happens when we acknowledge them, learn from them, and work to do better. Small diamond, it's easy to assume we're fair and just in our decisions, but are we really? Have we ever questioned our own biases? Small diamond, accountability isn't about punishment. It's about growth. About making sure that the mistake doesn't happen again. Isabella was lucky. She was given a second chance. But not everyone gets one. So before you jump to conclusions, whether it's about someone's place in first class, their background, or their worth, stop and think. Because a single moment of unquestioned bias can change someone's life forever. What do you think? Comment below. Do you believe Isabella truly changed? Would you have given her a second chance? Like this story if you believe in growth, accountability, and second chances. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that make you think, reflect, and grow. Because at the end of the day, we're all still learning.